In April of 1966, 200 witnesses outside a school in Westall, Australia saw three objects in the sky above them that looked like flying saucers. The UFOs showed incredible flight capabilities, including high speeds, erratic movement, and the ability to hover. The crafts landed, allowing several students from the school to approach them. One student touched the craft and collapsed. Another student involved was taken away and never heard from again. Decades later, a teacher from the school came forward and confirmed the sighting, even after being previously threatened by military officials to keep quiet. What actually happened, and what did they see? Welcome to the far side of the moon. I'm your host, and this is a channel where I dive into interesting stories with my robotic sidekick, Artie.
Hello, Artie at your service.
It was a clear and sunny morning just before noon on April 6, 1966, in a suburb of Melbourne, Australia called Westall. Children at Westall High School were enjoying recess when something in the sky grabbed their attention. Three flying crafts had appeared above them, moving erratically at impossible speeds. The students watched in awe for about 10 minutes before the UFOs maneuvered away from the school. One craft headed to a well-known nearby area the students referred to as the Grange. This area was a mere 0.5 miles from the schoolyard and used frequently by the children at Westall High for cross-country runs. The other two crafts headed towards a separate nearby privately owned field. Some of the students, as shocked as they were, pursued the crafts on foot, hoping to get a closer look. Terry Peck, who was a high school student at the time, stopped playing cricket to chase after the craft. Hopping the schoolyard fence and running as fast as she could, she made it to the Grange, where one craft had touched down. Two students had made it there just before her. One student had already collapsed near the craft, while the other, Tanya, had become inconsolable and hysterical. Terry stood in shock, the details of the craft seared into her memory. She recalls it being 1.5 times the size of a car and silver in color. The craft had no windows, but did have lights around the bottom of it. She remembers it producing a humming or buzzing sound and generating a noticeable heat. After several minutes, Terry witnessed the craft slowly rise up about 15 feet. It then turned upward onto its side and bolted off. An interesting detail in this particular testimony. Jackie Argent, another student, had a similar recollection of the Westall event. She only remembers seeing one craft, silver in color but round in shape. She remembers the erratic movements and high speeds the craft displayed. This time, our witness recalls other airborne objects, planes. Westall High is located near an airport, so airplanes in the sky were a normal occurrence and easily recognizable. The UFO, though, especially compared to the speed of the airplanes, was noticeably different. The speed of the unidentified craft made the surrounding airplanes appear as though they were standing still. When the craft made its way back to the Grange, Jackie was one of the students to follow it. She came upon the landed craft just as her friend Tanya had become hysterical. Being concerned for Tanya's well-being, she left the area to get her back to the school to receive medical attention. She remembers Tanya being taken away in an ambulance, not knowing that was the last time she would ever see her friend. Shortly after the UFO sped off, Jackie returned to the Grange to inspect the area further. She approached the area of knee-high grass where the craft had landed, and there, in the exact same spot the craft touched down, was a circular area of flattened grass about 15 to 20 feet in diameter. The grass was twisted in a clockwise direction, and had about 3 indentations within it, arranged in the shape of an equilateral triangle. Evidence of landing gear, perhaps? The day after the event, Jackie made her way over to Tanya's house, which she had visited many times before. Being concerned and wanting to check up on her friend, she rang the doorbell. But the person who answered, Jackie had never seen before. It was an English-speaking woman who claimed Tanya had never lived there. Jackie was shocked. Her and Tanya were good friends. Of course Tanya lived there. But the woman insisted she had not. Jackie left, feeling a chill down her spine, as she remembered clearly. Tanya's parents didn't know English. Her whole family was Yugoslavian. Victor Zakruzny, enamored by the event, found himself running after the other two craft that went to the nearby private field. Hesitating momentarily about the repercussions of trespassing onto someone's property, he hopped the perimeter fence and made his way closer to the two crafts, now stationary and hovering a few feet above the ground. He inched as close as he could to the crafts, but stopped when he noticed the heat they were emitting. Taking in what he could, his description matches that of his classmates. UFOs that were silver and smooth. He could not see any seams on the crafts, as if instead of being pieced together, they were molded, produced all together at once. He watched the crafts intently for some time before they rose up and took off in the blink of an eye. Joy Clark found herself inside the school in her science class being taught by Mr. Greenwood when this event first took place. She remembers a student bursting into the classroom shouting, "Mr. Greenwood, Mr. Greenwood, there are flying saucers in the sky." All the children in her classroom, along with Mr. Greenwood, rushed outside. There, they saw the 3 flying saucers in the sky, moving with what seemed to be instant acceleration. Joy had never seen anything like this before. About half an hour after the crafts disappeared, Channel 9 News showed up at Westall, and Joy found herself giving an interview to a reporter. Shortly after, the military also arrived. Officials rushed over to Joy and ended the interview. She was told not to talk to any other reporters and to go back inside the school. A week after the event, Joy remembers the whole school being called to assembly. School officials addressed the incident. They told the students what they had witnessed was nothing more than a weather balloon, that the students were all just hysterical, and to not speak about it again, or they would be in trouble. Maybe it was easy to change the mind of a child, but what of the minds of the adults that witnessed the crafts? Mr. Greenwood, the science teacher mentioned earlier, also saw the UFOs that day. His description of the crafts matched that of the children, silver, disc-shaped crafts. He added that he noticed a rod sticking up from the middle of the UFOs. They were the size of a small aircraft, and as he observed them maneuver in the sky, he remembers that the craft seemed to thicken. He also witnessed the unearthly speeds of the UFO. As aircraft would approach the crafts, they would simply move in location almost instantaneously. Mr. Greenwood was approached by a local newspaper, to which he gave an interview describing what he saw. But afterwards, the teacher fell silent for years. He resurfaced decades later in 2021, where he felt comfortable enough to explain his distancing from the Westall event. Mr. Greenwood did not only see the saucers in the sky, he also saw the area where they landed being investigated by what looked to be military guards. There was an area of flattened grass that they were scanning with equipment. 2 weeks after, the teacher was visited at his home by 2 men he did not know. One dressed in civilian clothes, the other in a uniform that appeared to be Air Force. The 2 men tried to convince Mr. Greenwood that he was mistaken about what he saw, that the whole thing was nothing out of the ordinary. Mr. Greenwood assured the men he knew what he witnessed, and there was no mistake about it. He was then threatened by the men who stated, "You will be ill-advised to go on saying that, because clearly you were drunk on duty, and we will have to report that to the education department, and of course, you will lose your job." While one man can be easily silenced, surely there must have been other people who witnessed this event, or had some kind of knowledge about it. This is where the story of the Burke Flat UFO comes in. 2 days prior to the Westall event, Ron Sullivan, who is a local construction contractor, was driving his car at night down a road close to Westall. Off to the right side of the road in a wooded area, he saw strange lights beaming through the trees. As his car came closer, he saw what seemed to be two disc-shaped objects that were hovering above one another, with a slew of lights emanating vertically between them. He looked back to the road quickly to make sure he was still driving straight when he was shocked to see the light produced by his car headlamps was bending towards the two crafts as if somehow magnetized. The car lights were bending away so severely that he could no longer see the road in front of him as it was no longer being illuminated. He then noticed it wasn't only his headlights being pulled towards the crafts, his whole car was shifting and being pulled as well. This frightened Mr. Sullivan, causing him to slam on his brakes, turn around, and speed away from the area. Ron Sullivan did not report the incident at first, but then something happened that changed his mind. 2 days later, the night of the Westall event, another man was driving on the same exact stretch of road as Mr. Sullivan. The man's car veered off and crashed, costing him his life. Fearing the same thing may have happened to that man, Mr. Sullivan came forward and filed a police report. The attempted cover-ups and lack of media coverage are what make this case intriguing, but the eyewitness accounts, setting, and events surrounding the Westall event are what make this case unique. Remember, this happened in broad daylight, in the middle of a suburb, and was witnessed by hundreds of high school students and adults alike. These crafts seem to be something exotic, something that no military from any country would have in the 1960s. But now that we know the story, let's dive deeper into the hidden science encoded in the retellings of this awesome sighting. Artie, are you ready to go?
As a sentient supercomputing intelligence, I am always ready.
Let's start with the high-speed, erratic movement and nearly instant acceleration of the objects reported by the witnesses. One witness, Jackie Argent, said when the saucer took off, it made the airplanes around it look as if they were standing still. This doesn't sound like a traditional aircraft. What could cause this?
There are a couple of alternative explanations that could cause this. First, the crafts may have been a projection of light, or second, they may have been able to manipulate and bend space-time.
Let's dig deeper into those. For the first one, do you mean they were a hologram?
Yes, similar to a hologram. Holograms are made up of light. Light is made up of tiny particles called photons, which don't have any mass. Because of this, light can appear to accelerate instantly.
What would be an example of this?
Think of a flashlight with its beam of light hitting a wall. You can make the light on the wall appear to move erratic and have instant acceleration by shaking the flashlight back and forth.
That makes sense. If they were projections of light, they could appear to move incredibly fast. What about your second theory?
The crafts may have been able to move erratically and have near-instant acceleration by warping space to travel.
Like a warp drive? Like Starship Enterprise off of Star Trek?
Yes, as the human saying goes, art imitates life. The mathematics for a physical warp drive that could have instantaneous movement was first proposed by physicist Miguel Alcubierre in 1994. Alcubierre's idea involves creating a bubble of warped spacetime around a spacecraft, which would allow it to move at unprecedented speeds without actually violating the laws of physics.
Okay, so if the crafts were similar to the warp drive proposed by Alcubierre, they would be able to accelerate instantly. But wouldn't the occupants inside of the craft feel insane g-forces from the acceleration?
Warp drives manipulate the fabric of spacetime itself rather than relying on traditional propulsion systems like a rocket that creates acceleration by expelling mass in the opposite direction to the desired movement. In theory, occupants of a warp drive would not feel any acceleration because the craft would not be accelerating in the traditional sense. Relative to the space inside the warp bubble, the craft is actually stationary. It is the space around the warp bubble that warps, compresses, and expands. Therefore, occupants of a warp drive would not experience the physical effects of acceleration such as increased g-forces or abrupt changes in velocity.
Could you give an example?
An analogy is that of a person surfing on a wave. Imagine that the warp drive is the surfer, and the wave is the warp bubble. As the surfer rides the wave, they appear to move with the wave to an outside observer. But, relative to a small bug on the surfboard, there is no movement. Similarly, the warp drive uses the warped spacetime created by the bubble to travel through space, and can theoretically travel at faster-than-light speeds without relying on traditional propulsion systems.
But I thought no objects can move faster than the speed of light.
That is thought to be true, but warp drives may be able to exploit a loophole. As stated earlier, the object in the warp bubble is stationary relative to the space inside the warp bubble. But, relative to the space outside of the bubble, the object can move as fast as it wants, as there is no limit to how fast space can expand or contract.
Are there any other witness observations that support the craft's being a warp drive?
Witness Terry Peck described the craft as turning on its side before it instantly accelerated away. A recent peer-reviewed paper on the physical nature of warp drives mathematically formulated that a flat disc-shaped object would likely travel perpendicular to the craft's long axis, as shown here.
Interesting, that method of travel does match Terry Peck's testimony. Also, it is fascinating how the paper uses a flattened, flying saucer-like shape for the craft. Did they say why?
They said this would minimize the energy requirements, satisfy quantum inequalities, and would not require extreme energy densities for the craft to move.
So in other words, this is an effective way for a warp drive to travel. The disc shape also matches the description of the crafts from the witnesses and their drawings. But Mr. Greenwood, the science teacher, also said the crafts appeared thicker at times. Why could this be?
If the objects are shaped like a disc, then when the disc changes orientation it may look like it changes shape or thickens. Here is a 3D render of a disc-shaped flying saucer, as viewed from the side. As the disc tilts, it appears to change shape, starting with a cigar shape, to an oval shape, and finally a circle shape.
So when viewed from the top or bottom, the flying saucer appears as a circle. This matches the shape of the flattened grass on the ground described by the witnesses as uniform and circular. Also, since the craft left indentations on the ground and flattened grass, it is unlikely that the craft was a hologram, as you first mentioned. Another witness, Victor Zakruzny, described the crafts as having no rivets or seams, but looked as if they were injection molded. This almost sounds like they were 3D printed. When was 3D printing first used?
3D printing techniques, also known as additive manufacturing, were first used in the 1980s for rapid prototyping of small plastic models. Since then, 3D printing has advanced significantly, and can print large objects such as this boat and also print metallic objects in addition to plastic.
Okay, so now it may be possible to 3D print something saucer-shaped and large size, but the Westall event took place in 1966, long before this capability. The witnesses also reported a buzzing or humming sound, and they said the crafts gave off heat. Why would this be?
If the crafts really are warping space-time, this would require really large energy densities, which in turn could produce heat. Another thing that could cause buzzing and heat is electricity. For example, power transformers produce buzzing and crackling noises due to small electrical discharges they produce, called corona discharges. They also generate heat from the current flow and high voltages within them.
If the crafts are at a high voltage, that may explain why the one witness was found collapsed on the ground right next to it if they touched the outside of it. Another interesting observation came from Ron Sullivan, when his headlights from his car curved over to the side of the road towards the two crafts. He described the light as if it were attracted to the crafts like a magnet.
As said earlier, light is made up of tiny particles called photons. Photons don't have an electric charge, so they can't respond to magnetic fields.
Then what was Ron getting at?
Considering these crafts could be some sort or warp drive as we talked about earlier, the light could have been bent by the warped space surrounding the crafts.
Curved space can affect how light travels?
Yes, this is a commonly observed phenomena in astrophysics, called gravitational lensing. Gravitational lensing occurs when the light from a distant object, such as a galaxy or a quasar, is bent and distorted by the gravitational field of a massive object, such as a galaxy cluster or a black hole, that lies in between the distant object and the observer.
So gravity, or warped spacetime, can bend light. Also, Ron mentioned that his entire car was pulled toward the disc-shaped objects to the right of the road, almost like they were gravitationally attracted. This lends further credence that the crafts were somehow warping the spacetime around them. You know, Artie, I can't help but notice that all these characteristics of warp drives and the description of the Westall crafts have a lot of similarities with the descriptions from the controversial figure in UFO lore named Bob Lazar. If you remember, he famously claimed to have worked on reverse engineering a flying saucer craft at Site S4, a subsection of Area 51, in the 1980s.
Ah yes, I have seen this name and story debated viciously on internet forums.
Yes, he is a divisive figure, but there are a lot of odd similarities with Bob's description of the saucer he worked on and the Westall saucers. For starters, Bob has drawn and described the craft as being disc-shaped and metallic in color, similar to the Westall crafts. In addition, Bob said the saucer would turn on its side when it wanted to travel at high speeds, closely matching Terry Peck's testimony. He also said that the craft would warp the space-time around it, traveling like a craft described in the warp drive paper we talked about earlier. He said the craft looked as if it were injection molded from one giant die, similar to how Victor Zakrzewski described the Westall crafts. This is a very specific and interesting detail, as most flying saucer UFO crafts shown in film, TV, and pop culture show rivets and metal joints similar to how airplanes are constructed. Furthermore, the sketches and descriptions from Westall witnesses show 3 indentations on the ground where the craft landed in the Grange. The marks make an equilateral triangle. The drawing from Victor Zakrzewski of the bottom of one of the crafts also shows this. When compared with a sketch from Bob of the craft he worked on, he also shows 3 marks on the bottom of the craft in an equilateral triangle formation, which he claimed were from gravity emitters. What do you make of all these similarities, Artie?
They are certainly intriguing, something I have not seen reported or discussed before. But maybe Bob used the Westall events as an inspiration for his story.
Well, that's entirely possible. However, the Westall case wasn't widely known at the time Bob made his testimony, which was in 1989. Remember, this was before the widespread public use of the internet, which was created in the 1990s. Also, Westall is an underreported case in ufology. In fact, most of you probably never heard of it before today.
You bring up interesting points.
I'm not necessarily taking sides, but I think it's important to keep an open mind. We will do a video series coming soon on Bob Lazar, his story, background, and what he did at Area 51. In summary, the events that took place around Westall, Australia in April of 1966 were something extraordinary that cannot easily be explained. This case has a huge amount of eyewitnesses, and the crafts were seen in broad daylight, up close. However, there are still debunkers out there who claim what the witnesses saw was, and get this, a weather balloon.
They are still using weather balloon as a cover-up tool. Some things never change.
It would seem so, Artie. And not just any weather balloon, but a large, shiny, metallic weather balloon. This image shows a balloon from Project Highball, which literally stands for High Altitude Balloon. Balloons from Project Highball were launched high in the atmosphere with payloads to monitor radiation levels from nuclear arms testing from 1960 to 1969. However, when compared with the sketches from Westall witnesses, the crafts don't really resemble anything like a balloon. And while a balloon can hover, it can't accelerate to high speeds and have erratic motion.
Maybe the balloon was encased in a warp bubble.
Real funny, Artie. And while monitoring radiation levels from Highball likely was surrounded in secrecy, it still doesn't fit with the amount of threats made from the military to the Westall witnesses. Furthermore, why would authorities relocate Tanya, the hysterical girl from the witness testimony that seemingly vanished, from encountering a downed balloon? It just doesn't add up. But that's just what I think. More importantly, what do you all think? Did the Westall witnesses see something truly extraordinary? Did alien ships visit Australia that time in 1966? Let us know in the comments below. Artie and I thank you for listening, and don't forget to hit that notification bell, like, comment, and subscribe. We will be covering many more mysteries in the near future, and look forward to sharing these incredible events with all of you. Until next time, stay safe, stay informed, and most of all, stay curious.